The text my brother sent came in at 6:17 on a Tuesday morning. I know the exact time because I'd been awake since 5, lying in the dark, staring at the ceiling the way I'd been doing most nights for the past 3 months. Don't come to Mom's birthday dinner. You're not welcome. We've made our decision as a family. No question mark. No explanation. 12 words and a period like a door being shut in my face. I read it twice. Then I set my phone face down on the nightstand, got up, and made coffee. My hands weren't shaking. I wasn't crying. What I felt was something quieter and harder than either of those things. It was the feeling of finally being right about something I had desperately hoped I was wrong about. I didn't text back. Not yet. Instead, I opened my laptop and pulled up the LLC operating agreement I had co-signed 14 months earlier. The one that listed me as a 30% stakeholder in my family's catering business. The one that gave me signature authority over vendor contracts and the business checking account. I read it slowly, the way my contracts professor had taught me to read anything with your name on it. Then I made a second cup of coffee, sat down at my kitchen table in the gray morning light, and started building a plan. My mother started the business the year I turned 9. She called it Beaumont Table, after our last name and after the big farmhouse table in our grandmother's kitchen, where every holiday meal happened. My grandmother made everything from scratch. My mother inherited her hands and her recipes and her obsessive need to feed people until they couldn't move. By the time I was in middle school, Beaumont Table was catering small events. By the time I graduated high school, it was doing weddings. By the time I finished my business degree and came home at 24, it was a real company with 6 employees, a commercial kitchen lease, and a reputation that filled its calendar 6 months out. My mother was the heart of it. My brother Terrence was the face. And I was the one who made sure everything held together in between. That was never stated out loud, it was just understood. I managed the vendor relationships, rewrote the contracts after a supplier dispute nearly cost us a January wedding, built the invoicing system, handled permits and licensing renewals, and trained our coordinator when she came on in her first week. Terrence did the client consultations and the walkthroughs and the handshakes. My mother cooked. It worked. For a while, it genuinely worked. The first site I missed was small enough to dismiss. It was during a vendor meeting I wasn't invited to. Terrence said he'd handled it, that I was busy, that there was nothing to worry about. I believed him because we were family and because I wanted to believe him. That's the thing about growing up in a house where you needed to earn your place. You get very good at convincing yourself everything is fine. The second sign was harder to ignore. I found it by accident, the way most things get found. I was pulling together our quarterly numbers for an insurance review, and I noticed a line item that didn't match. A catering supply vendor I didn't recognize had been paid $4,200 over 3 months. When I looked up the company name, it came back to an LLC registered to an address I recognized immediately, my brother's girlfriend's apartment. I sat with that for 3 days before I said anything. I built a spreadsheet. I pulled every receipt I could access. I found a total of $11,000 moved to that vendor account over 7 months. There were no corresponding supply deliveries, no invoices with itemized goods, just payments, labeled vaguely as supplies and materials, authorized by my brother. I brought it to my mother on a Sunday afternoon. I printed everything and laid it out on her kitchen table like evidence, because that's what it was. She listened. She didn't look at the papers. She looked at me. When I finished, she said, "He's trying to grow the business. He's making connections." I asked her what connections required, $11,000 in unmarked payments to an LLC his girlfriend owned. She said I was being divisive. I drove home that night and sat in my car in my own driveway for 20 minutes, not because I was devastated, because I was calculating. What happened after that happened slowly, the way things do when a family is trying to manage a problem without naming it. My access to the accounting software was quietly downgraded. I was CC'd on fewer emails. When I raised questions in our group thread, Terrence would answer them in a way that made me sound like I was overcomplicating things, and my mother would follow up with something soft and redirecting, like, "Let's all try to be on the same page." Then they hired someone new, a business manager. A man named Philip who wore blazers to site visits and called himself a hospitality consultant. My mother introduced him at a team meeting like he was a gift, like his arrival was a solution to a problem nobody had defined yet. Philip took over the vendor relationships within a month. He took my coordinator aside for a private meeting I wasn't notified about. When I asked my mother why she hadn't mentioned the hire to me, she said Terrence had recommended him and it had all moved quickly. I smiled and said I was sure he'd be a great addition. That night I called my best friend Vera, who had been a paralegal for 6 years and had the useful quality of not sugarcoating anything. I told her what was happening. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "They're phasing you out. The question is whether they're going to pay you on the way out or just push you through the door." I already knew the answer. $11,000 told me the answer. I want to be clear about something. I didn't go into what happened next wanting to hurt anyone. I went into it because I had spent 3 years building something real, and I had watched my brother drain it quietly, and I had watched my mother choose to look away, and I had decided that if they were going to treat my name like a resource they could use and discard, then I was going to be very precise about what my name was actually worth. I called Vera back the next morning. She connected me with a business attorney she trusted. I drove to his office on a Wednesday and I sat down and I told him everything. I brought the spreadsheet. I brought the contract. I brought the screenshots of the vendor payments and the LLC registration and the timeline of my access being slowly revoked. He reviewed everything carefully. Then he leaned back and said, "You have standing, and depending on how this plays out, you have leverage." He explained what my 30% stake actually meant in terms of fiduciary protections. He explained what my co-signature on the operating account meant in terms of what I could and couldn't authorize. He explained that the payments my brother had made might not just be an internal family problem. They might constitute unauthorized distribution of business funds. Then, he said, "What do you want the outcome to be?" I thought about it. I thought about my grandmother's kitchen table and my mother's hands and the reason the company was called what it was called. Then I thought about $11,000 and a vendor meeting I wasn't invited to and a business manager in a blazer and 12 words on a Tuesday morning. I told him I wanted out. Completely. And I wanted my name protected on the way out. He nodded like he'd expected that. He said, "Then let's make sure the exit is yours to control." We spent 2 weeks preparing. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. I went to family dinners. I answered emails. I helped our coordinator update the menu templates for spring bookings. I smiled at Philip when he came through the kitchen and I asked him how he was settling in. Inside, I was building a firewall. My attorney drafted a formal notice of intent to dissolve my membership interest. We documented every instance of my access being restricted. We requested a formal accounting of all vendor payments over the past year under my rights as a stakeholder. That request alone was significant because it forced a paper trail. If they responded, the irregular payments would be on record. If they didn't respond within the legal window, that was also on record. I moved my personal savings into an individual account I'd opened at a separate bank. Nothing joint, nothing connected to the business. I updated my personal credit file and documented my standing separately from any business liabilities. And then I waited for the right moment. It came at 6/7/17 on a Tuesday morning in the form of 12 words from my brother. I read the text again over my second cup of coffee. Then I typed back 2 words. "Sounds good." I set my phone down and opened my email. I sent 2 things that morning. The first was to the business bank, where I was listed as an authorized co-signer, formally requesting a review of unauthorized transactions in the vendor accounts and notifying them that I would be initiating a membership dissolution and requesting my name be flagged pending review of the account irregularities. The second was to my attorney, with 1 line. "They made the first move. We can proceed." He filed the formal documents that afternoon. I want to tell you what the next 48 hours felt like, because it wasn't what I expected. I expected to feel relieved. I expected to feel vindicated, or maybe sad, or maybe some complicated mixture of all 3. What I actually felt was quiet. Like the kind of quiet that comes into a room after a noise you've been hearing so long you stopped registering it finally stops. I went to work. I cooked dinner. I called Vera and we talked about something completely unrelated for an hour. I slept through the night for the first time in months. The first call came the next morning. My mother. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice was different than I'd heard it before. Not angry. Not soft in the practice way. She got soft when she was managing a situation. Just uncertain. Like she was calling from somewhere she didn't recognize. She said the bank had flagged the account. She said Terrence was getting calls she didn't understand. She said, "I think something went wrong, honey. Can you please call me back?" I called back that evening. She asked what was happening. I told her I had initiated a review of the vendor accounts and begun the process of formally withdrawing my membership interest. She said, "You're doing this because of the dinner, because of what Terrence said." I said, "I'm doing this because of $11,000 and a vendor company no one told me about and a business manager hired without my knowledge and months of having my access quietly removed. The dinner is just when I decided to stop waiting." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "We were going to talk to you. We just needed more time." And I said, gently, because she was still my mother and I still loved her, "You had 3 years. Terrence called 4 times in one day. I didn't pick up for the first 3. On the 4th, I did. He didn't say hello. He said, 'What did you do?' I said, 'I protected myself.' He said the bank had frozen the vendor account pending review. He said Philip was asking questions he couldn't answer. He said the spring event calendar was at risk if the business accounts were flagged much longer. I said I was sorry to hear that. He said, 'You're blowing up a family business over nothing.' I said, 'I'm withdrawing from a company that was paying unauthorized vendor fees to your girlfriend's LLC. That's not nothing. That's actually exactly what the bank is going to call it too.'" He hung up. 30 minutes later, my mother called again. This time her voice was different, tight. She said Terrence had explained the vendor situation. She said it was a misunderstanding, that the payments were for legitimate services, that he was going to provide documentation. I said I was glad to hear documentation existed and that the bank and my attorney would be happy to review it. She said, "This is your family. You don't bring lawyers into your family." I said, "You brought someone into the business without telling me and slowly removed my access until I was signing documents I wasn't informed about. I'm not the one who changed what this was." She started to cry. Real tears, not strategy. I knew the difference by now. I told her I loved her. I told her that hadn't changed and wasn't going to change. And I told her that the business decisions I was making were separate from that and that she was going to need to let them be separate. Then I said goodnight and I hung up. The review took 3 weeks. My attorney was methodical and thorough in a way I came to deeply appreciate. He wasn't dramatic about any of it, he just worked. The bank's findings were not favorable to Terrence. The documentation he provided for the vendor payments was incomplete in ways that triggered a secondary review. 2 payments were flagged as potentially misclassified. The business's line of credit, which had been quietly extended in ways I hadn't been informed about, was placed under review. Philip quietly resigned. The catering coordinator, a woman who had become a genuinely good professional under the systems I'd built, called me personally to say she was sorry for how things had gone. She said the office felt different. I thanked her and I meant it. My membership dissolution was finalized cleanly. I was bought out at fair market valuation, calculated based on documented contribution and equity position. My attorney had built the case for that number carefully, and it held. On the day the paperwork was signed, my attorney shook my hand across his conference table and said, "You handled this with more patience than most people would have." I said I'd had a lot of practice being patient. There was a meeting. Of course there was a meeting. My mother called it. 2 weeks after the bank review concluded, in the private room of a restaurant we'd catered 3 times. Same round table, same candles on the sideboard. Terrence sat with his arms crossed. My mother sat between us like a referee who'd already lost control of the game. I got there first and ordered water. When they arrived, Terrence didn't look at me. My mother sat down and smoothed her napkin and said, "I just want us to talk like a family." I said, "That's what I'm here for." She said she wanted to understand if there was a way to move forward, if there was something that could be repaired. I said, "The business is yours. I hope you're able to stabilize it. I genuinely do." Terrence looked up for the first time. He said, "You don't actually care. You just wanted to make your point." I looked at him. He was my brother. I had covered for him in small ways for years before the vendor situation. A missed deadline here, a double-booked event there. I had thought I was protecting the family, when really I was just making it easier for him not to be accountable. I said, I cared so much that I spent 3 years doing the work that kept the company viable. I cared so much that I flagged the vendor situation privately before I did anything else. I cared so much that I gave you every opportunity to tell the truth before I involved anyone outside the family. The question isn't whether I cared. The question is whether any of that registered. He didn't answer. My mother said, "What would it take for you to come back?" I said, "I'm not coming back. Not because I was punishing them. Not because I wanted them to hurt. But because I had learned something in those 3 years that I couldn't unlearn, being needed is not the same as being respected. I had been indispensable to that business in ways that were never acknowledged and never protected, and once I had started asking questions, I had become a problem to be managed instead of a person to be heard. I wasn't willing to go back to being useful on those terms. I told my mother I would always be her daughter. That Sunday dinners and phone calls and the things that lived outside of business hours, none of that had to change if she didn't want it to. She nodded. Her eyes were wet. I told Terrence I hoped he figured it out. Then I picked up my bag and walked out into the parking lot and stood in the cold air for a moment and breathed. Here's what I didn't expect about what came after. I didn't expect how much space there would be, not just in my schedule, though that was real too. I mean internal space, the part of my brain that had been quietly running calculations. Is this right? Is this fair? How do I document this? How do I protect myself? Went quiet. For the first time in years, I was thinking about what I actually wanted to build. I started consulting. Small food businesses, mostly. A woman who ran a dumpling shop out of a shared kitchen space and needed her vendor contracts reviewed. A couple who had built a small event farm and didn't understand what their LLC actually protected them from. A bakery owner who was thinking about bringing in a partner and wanted someone to walk through what that agreement should look like before she signed anything. I was good at it. Better than I'd realized, because I'd been practicing inside a situation with real stakes for 3 years. Vera, who had watched the whole arc of the Beaumont table situation from the sidelines, started sending me referrals. Then her paralegal colleague started sending them. Within 4 months, I had more work than I had hours, and I was doing it entirely on my own terms. I thought about my grandmother sometimes, about the table the company was named after, about what it meant to build something around a family, and what happened when the family part stopped holding up its end. I didn't think she would have wanted it to go the way it went. But I also think she would have understood why I left. She was a practical woman. She believed in clean accounts and honest work and not letting people take things from you while smiling about it. The letter came 6 weeks later, not from my brother, not from my mother, from the business bank, closing out the final notification on the account review. It was a single page. It confirmed that my name had been fully removed from all account authorizations. It confirmed there were no outstanding liabilities attached to my identification. It said, in the flat language of financial institutions, that my obligations were resolved. I read it standing at my kitchen counter with a cup of tea going cold beside me. Then I filed it in a folder on my desk and went back to the proposal I was writing for a client who was about to sign her first commercial kitchen lease and wanted to make sure she understood every line before she did. I sat down and I kept working. Not because I had something to prove, not because I was trying to outlast anyone or outshine anyone, or make sure the record showed I was right. Just because the work was good and it was mine and nobody had a signature on it but me. That was enough. That had always been enough. I just hadn't known it until the moment they told me not to come. I've thought a lot about what made everything collapse the way it did. Not because I want to assign blame. I think I'm past that. But because I think there's something honest worth saying about how these situations actually work. Terrence didn't wake up one morning and decide to steal. That's not how it goes. It starts smaller than that. A vendor payment that nobody questions. A meeting nobody follows up on. A sister who keeps showing up and fixing things quietly, which teaches everyone around her that things will always be fixed quietly. I was part of that system too. Every time I smoothed over one of his mistakes without saying anything directly, I was teaching him that the cost of his choices would be absorbed by someone else. That's not a judgment. That's just what happened, and I think it's worth being honest about. What I understand now is that integrity isn't really about the dramatic moments. It's not about what you do when someone is watching or when the stakes are obvious. It's about what you do with the small things. The $4,200 vendor line item nobody asked about. The meeting you weren't invited to. The access that disappeared without explanation. Those small things are always telling you something. I spent months convincing myself I was overreacting, that I was being divisive, that family meant absorbing things without naming them. That was the real cost, not the money. The time I spent pretending I hadn't seen what I'd seen. The attorney I worked with said something I've carried with me since. He said the people who come into his office in the worst positions are almost never the ones who acted too quickly. They're the ones who waited too long because they wanted to believe things would correct themselves. Situations don't self-correct. People either choose to correct them or they don't. And when they don't, the person who has been patient and quiet and reasonable is usually the one who ends up holding the liability. I documented everything. That's the practical lesson. And I think it matters enough to say plainly, document everything. Not because you're planning to go to war with your family, but because clarity is a form of self-respect. Knowing what you signed, what you contributed, what you're owed, that's not paranoia. That's intelligence applied to your own life. But the deeper thing, the thing that took me longer to understand, is about what happens after you leave. I thought the hardest part would be the conflict. The calls, the meeting at the restaurant, Terrence's voice going tight when he realized what I'd done. That wasn't the hard part. The hard part was figuring out who I was when I wasn't being useful to people who didn't appreciate it. That takes longer. And it asks more of you than any legal document does. What I found on the other side of it was something I hadn't expected. I was actually good. Not just competent in the way I'd always been told, good in a way that belonged to me, that nobody had granted and nobody could revoke. The clients I started working with after Beaumont Table, the woman with the dumpling shop, the couple with the event farm, they needed exactly what I had built inside a situation that never acknowledged it. That's how it works. What's taken from you in one place doesn't disappear. It waits. And if you're willing to do the work of reclaiming yourself, it shows up somewhere it's finally wanted. Terrence got what he built toward, so did I. That's not poetic justice. That's just cause and effect, lived out slowly over time. The last letter from the bank had zeros across the board. I filed it and went back to work. That was the whole ending. Sometimes that's enough.